Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Christine D'Eduardo, co-chair of the Women's Leadership Council Education Committee, along with Liz Sacco. We want to thank you very much for being here today at our second lecture of our 2017-18 series, and a very special screening of Aside From That, a film produced by one of our co-founders, Cindy Gruber. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Wingate Healthcare, for helping us make this series possible. We'd also like to acknowledge the support of Northbridge Insurance Agency and Carol Wilson, as well as Diane Robinson and the Northbridge companies for donating today's luncheons. I'm very pleased to announce that last week, the Women's Leadership Council approved their next major philanthropic initiative, a fund to assist Leahy Hospital and Medical Center patients who are at the end of life. This initiative will be a multi-year effort and envisioned, when fully funded, to have the potential to annually provide assistance to at least 50 families during this emotionally difficult time. I've just learned minutes ago that two Women's Leadership Council members have each committed $100,000 to a total of $200,000 to kickstart this initiative. And these two women right now want their gift to be anonymous. The Women's Leadership Council is committed to serving the community and through our philanthropic efforts and these lectures, helping make it healthier. By choosing to be here today, you have made time in your busy lives to focus on your own health and well-being as well as your families. It's gratifying to look out and see so many women and a very few welcome men here in this auditorium. Our hope is that you will find this movie and our panel to be informative, thought-provoking, and applicable to your lives. A very important housekeeping note, please be sure to silence your phone and put your pagers on vibrate. I would now like to introduce Dr. Howard Grant, who is CEO and President of our medical center and the entire Leahy Health System.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am thrilled that the auditorium is nearly full. First, let me make a comment about the Women's Leadership Council, and those of you who are on the council or here today, you know who you are. I hear about that gift. The Women's Leadership Council has helped us out whenever we've been in a pinch on really critically important initiatives for the organization. And this is a subject that doesn't get nearly the attention that it should get, particularly in large healthcare systems. And so leave it to the Women's Leadership Council to keep us honest and get us focused on what we need to be focused on. So you know who you are, and I thank you deeply for your support. So why is this movie so important? It asks a really difficult question. One of the hardest questions, in fact. And I've learned this from Cindy Gruber. How do we live knowing that we're going to die? How do we lead our lives knowing that we're going to die? So just a moment of personal reflection for me. This subject had a huge impact on my life, and I didn't know it was having that impact at the time. My mother died after a grueling 5-year battle with cancer during my high school and college years. And neither my mother nor my family ever tended to that question during the entire time of her illness. In retrospect, the healthcare system failed us by not providing us that path. And as a result, I became a physician. That's why I became a physician, because the system had failed us, and I thought we needed to do a better job. Aside from that, has been featured at the Boston Film Festival, the Rhode Island Film Festival, the Big Water Film Festival, and it also won the Gold Remy at the Houston International Film Festival. The movie runs about 65 minutes. and then there will be a discussion with a fabulous guest of panelists. First, I want to introduce Dr. Susan Block, who is the founder and senior advisor for the Serious Illness Care Program at Ariadne Labs. And I'm pleased to announce that Leahy has been chosen one of 2 health systems in Massachusetts to partner with her organization on their serious illness program. Secondly, Dr. Beth Collins, who's the medical director of our palliative care service here at Leahy Hospital and Medical Center. Third, Cindy Gruber, the executive director of Aside From That and the founding member of the Women's Leadership Council. And Dr. Wayne Saltzman, chief medical officer for Leahy Health Continuing Care, assistant professor at Tufts Medical School, and the chief of the Geriatrics and Transitional Care Center at Leahy. Journalist Jim Sullivan will be the moderator for the panel. I know that you will all enjoy the movie and find yourself reflecting on your own values as you watch it. It is now my pleasure to present Aside From That. Enjoy it. Thank you all so much for being here today.
I think everybody was introduced at the beginning, but there were no faces to go with the names. So if you want to do a quick introduction, and actually at the very far end, Richard Silkin, who we missed during the introduction, is the director, writer, and producer. But why don't we go down the line and tell everybody who you are and what your specialty is.
Well, I guess you just said.
I just told you.
So moving on.
I'm Wayne Saltzman. I am a geriatrician. I'm a hospice and palliative care doctor. I'm the head of geriatrics here for the Leahy system. Very happy to be here.
Susan Block. I'm a psychiatrist and palliative care physician and the founding director of the Serious Illness Care Program at Ariadne Labs, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School.
I'm Beth Collins, and I'm the medical director of Leahy Hospital Medical Center's palliative care program.
Cindy Gruber, executive producer of Aside From That, and also a member of the Women's Leadership Council.
I got one.
Oh. Jim, you want to introduce yourself?
No, I did at the beginning. Since we just saw the film, and that's fresh, hopefully, in our minds, I wanted to ask Richard and Cindy just to start with the basic question of what they thought they were getting into when they started this project, and after it was all done and screened, what the result has been, how it's affected them personally. Richard, do you want to?
Well, I really did, when I was 5 years old, have a very clear. I didn't have a clear understanding of what happened, and as I grew up and asking people, a lot of people seemed like, including my family, didn't want to discuss mortality, and so I think in the back of my mind, I always thought this would be an interesting topic for people to contemplate, and also wondering if you can keep that focus. Does it really help you live a more meaningful life? Or, because sometimes when I think about it, it kind of throws me into a depression. So I was curious about that. And I think it's a very universally complex issue, like Stephen Wright, mentioned about it being a math problem that's hard to digest. I think it's really hard to get your mind around it. I was watching 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago. There was a piece on they just upgraded the Hubble telescope, and they were talking about there's trillions of galaxies now. And to me, that's very similar. It's a very difficult way, I think, very difficult thing to try to grasp. So, Cindy, I don't know if you want to.
I was going through a difficult time. My mother was dying of Alzheimer's. Rachel, who you saw in the movie, who was a very close friend, had been diagnosed with ALS. I was having some health issues that I didn't know what the result would be. And so I was grappling with this sort of mortality issue. Richard and I had dinner one night, and he I had suggested that we do something creative together, and we were talking about this particular topic and decided wouldn't it be interesting to figure this out ourselves, and in the process of this journey make a movie so that it could create conversations with our audience. And I hope that it does that today. But it's still it's a compelling issue, and I think the movie deals with just one aspect of it, which is the emotional. I think there are a couple of other aspects, which is the practical, whether you're dealing with wills or end-of-life decisions, and of course the medical issue. And I think everybody here is probably in some way competent to talk about each of those issues.
I just want to share a personal anecdote for a minute before I move on. My mother was in this hospital 2 months ago. She died 2 months ago, and I talked to her last here. She was moved to hospice in Danvers the day afterwards. She died 2 days later there. And she'd been on heavy doses of morphine, but when my wife and I were able to speak with her, we had about 45 minutes with her, and she was very clear-headed, and it was the most moving experience, touching experience of my life, I think. I held her hand throughout, and one thing she said that was extremely moving was she said, you know, we look at death through most of our life at like an arm's distance, like it's out there. And she just looked me in the eye and she said, I'm staring at it right now, our hand right up there. And well, that's kind of what this is all about, I guess, is learning to appreciate all of that and the distance that comes to all of us when it comes close. Anyway, Dr. Block, your father went through some pretty serious stuff. I'll just say stuff. And do you want to tell me about that and how that has affected your work and what you do with other doctors?
My dad was a professor at UC Berkeley and developed quadriplegia from a medical error. Before the surgery, which gave him the quadriplegia, he and I had had a very difficult conversation, which I had been extremely reluctant to have with him, and which he was even more reluctant to have with me. And the first part of the conversation went poorly. This was in San Francisco, and I left the hospital anticipating that he would go into the operating room the next morning, and came and got halfway across the Bay Bridge, got off, and came back because I realized that I just couldn't allow him to go to the hospital and to have this surgery without having a further conversation. I forced myself to have it, and he hung in there. And you know, I felt like I really needed to understand, because it was a very risky surgery. And I said, you know, how much are you willing to go through if things get really bad? And he said, I'm a tough guy, and I'm willing to go through a lot. And I asked him, you know, what's the minimal acceptable quality of life that you're willing to live with? And he said, if I can watch football and eat chocolate ice cream, I'm good to go. And the ice cream I totally knew. I'd never in my entire life seen my father watch a football game, so that was perplexing. And then several days later, when I actually had to make the decision about whether to go forward with a second operation with an even higher risk for him, the doctor said, well, should we do this, or should we just let him die? And I was his proxy, and what I realized was my dad had given me all the information I needed. And I asked the surgeon, how much is he going to have to go through if he survives this? He said a lot. And I said, what are the chances? How likely is he to be able to eat chocolate ice cream and watch football at the end of this? And he said, well, even if things go really badly, he'll probably be able to do that. And so my dad made the decision about whether he wanted the surgery. And it was a very profound, I was speaking for him, but he had answered the question about what he wanted done. And it was an incredible relief to me not to have to make that decision for him, to feel that he had bought into it, and I would never have forgiven myself if I had allowed him to die, and I would never have forgiven myself watching the suffering that he endured in recovering. But he went on to write 2 books, lived 10 more years, and then had a beautiful death with all of his family around him subsequently, at the time that he chose. And so it was a pretty amazing conversation and series of events that conversation triggered for all of us, not just him, for our entire family.
Dr. Collins, you're Director of Palliative Care, correct? Right. Okay. Let me ask you this. I mean, in terms of the doctors that you deal with and talk with, do you feel the doctors who deal individually with their patients are up to snuff with talking about this very serious subject with the people that they're dealing with? Has it reached a point where doctors are very good at that now?
I think it's reached a point that we all realize it's important. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure everybody is comfortable with it. I think it's the same way why this film was created, is it's this taboo topic that we don't talk about. And talking about it never makes it real. Talking about it just helps us all have more understanding and peace and conversations about it. So I do think that we are improving, but we are really needing to become better at it. And part of the problem with our health system and our 15-minute quick appointments, it makes it really hard to have these really important discussions and conversations. So I think that's why it's important that everybody knows it's important to every single one of us to know we need to initiate these conversations ourselves too, and that we need to be able to say what is important to us and what we want. And talking about it is never going to make it happen. Talking about it actually will help us all have more peace and less anxiety over it. And one of the things with Ariadne Labs that Dr. Block is a co-founder of, and the serious illness program that you all might have heard of, and Dr. Atul Gavan's book, Being Mortal, which many of you might have read, this is the doctor that he talks about in the 2nd chapter, where he says, you know, he asked one of his palliative care colleagues, how do I even talk to people about what's important? And Dr. Block gave him a few of the questions that she even used with her father in this discussion. And that's what actually led to the Serious Illness Conversation Guide. So it's really, I think, a full circle.
Would you say Being Mortal is a book that all of us should read?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I gave it to my entire palliative care team for Christmas that year.
Dr. Saltzman, how does, in your world, I mean, you deal a lot, I'm sure, with the geriatric population here. How does it affect you and them? I mean, obviously, this is more of a high-intensity issue the older you get.
So I will tell you that today is trash day in Burlington. And every trash day I go to my office in my home. I live in Burlington. And I get ready for the recycling. And today I threw away 12 completed death certificates from the last 2 weeks. So death, as a geriatrician, it sounds obvious, but it is my reality. And while I agree about the distinction that was made in the film about, you know, good death, bad death, doesn't matter, it's death. I'm reminded of my younger daughter who's a grammar freak and tells me there's a difference between good and well. And I lose sleep at night wondering if I have done everything I can to make the end of life of an elder a living piece of history, as well as it could be. And this morning, 2 elders died on my service. One was a 94-year-old lady who was very sick and just in and out of the hospital. And it came up to the point where, what do we do now? And I sat down with the son, who was in his 70s. Children in my world are in their 60s, 70s, and often 80s. So I sat down with her child And all he wanted to hear in the end analysis was that Mom was at the end of life, and it was okay. And his mom died 2 days later. And the other was an Orthodox Jewish gentleman who had a profound neurologic disease, and he died this morning after being on hospice for a significant amount of time. And it was tough to get him on hospice. It wasn't that he needed hospice, so to speak. I'm a hospice doctor. But his sister needed the benefits of hospice. And when I called his sister this morning to tell her that he had died, and this was a gentleman who his sister knew everything and multiple conversations, and she said, from New York, I didn't realize he was that bad. So the care of elders is a privilege. It is difficult to remind my colleagues that they are a unique segment of the adult population, and we have to think differently about them than we do other adults. And that's a constant battle.
I want to open up to questions in a second, but one thing, Cindy, you and I had talked about on the phone about, I forget what you called them, but like book clubs, except about talking about death. Was that, you want to tell people a little bit about that? That sounded very interesting to me.
Yeah, well, when we were doing some research on the movie, we came up with something called death cafes.
That's it.
My meditation teacher is, I think here, Marianne, are you there?
Over here,
Where are you?
Here. Hi.
Oh, okay. Marianne actually does a death cafe in Lexington, Mass, if you're interested. But death cafes are similar to book clubs, and they've become much more popular since we were doing the research for our movie. There was one in San Francisco. There was one in New York City. And people get together and actually have these conversations surrounding their own mortality, surrounding, getting older. You can meet with Marianne after if you're interested, but it again takes the anxiety out of the topic, that other people are thinking in a similar way, that just the fact that you're talking about it and you're facing it in some way alleviates some of that emotional upheaval.
Should we open it up to the audience? Christina, are you out there with a microphone? I can't see very well into the dark, so if you can spot anybody who's got some.
It's one thing to approach the topic, to look at the topic, and to deal with it when you're still in the abstract. But when you are someone faced with a terminal illness and you don't know how much time you have and you're living test to test and visit to visit, what is there to really help people with that anxiety and existential fear?
I can, from our practice in palliative care, and I see many patients in the outpatient clinic who are exactly at that point. And I always say my wish is that I could help them forget they have that disease. And so never to stop living, even when we're in the midst of all those treatments and we may not be feeling well, we're still living. So I always say, how do we figure out what's important? And we always have to keep joy in that. And how do we help then make the rest of the world help that person through that time in the best possible way? Because you never want to stop and think, well, until my treatments are done, I'm not going to do this. You have to keep living through that whole time. And I have to say, people really do that. A woman who was 85 years old, she was getting chemotherapy for cancer, and she said to me, I don't know how to ask my oncologist, but they give me my chemotherapy on Thursdays, but my husband and I go ballroom dancing on Fridays. Do you think that maybe we could switch it to earlier in the week? And I thought that's what it's all about. It's about what is important to her and for our medical treatments to work around that.
I wanted to tell you about when Rachel was dying at the end, and it was so difficult for her family and everyone around her. I think her cousin Susan was there with her, and I was in touch, emailing, almost daily. Susan sent me a photograph of Rachel. She was in some kind of breathing thing, but on the breathing thing was her clown nose. So right up until the end, she remembered that she wanted to be a clown, that she went after that motivation, that objective, that goal. And right before she died, she wanted to make sure that she had a picture of herself with that clown nose on her breathing machine.
I'll just add something. One of the things that Rachel's story sort of drove home for me is the importance for people, even when they're very ill, of feeling like they're making a contribution to others. And when you're sick, you feel diminished and devalued by your sickness. And being able to do what Rachel was doing, to try to make some contribution, as a hospital chaplain, and even to the people around her through making them laugh and so on, is something that I think is something that we forget. I think as healthy people, about how critically important it is for even the very ill to make contribution to other people. I think the other things, that I've learned about this is the importance of meaning, and this comes, goes back to, the work that was done during the Holocaust about how people stayed alive in concentration camps, and it was having a sense of meaning and purpose that allowed people to live through the suffering that they were enduring in that setting. And I think the third thing is relationships, and this film was so much about relationships and how those keep people going and sustain people kind of through the difficulties of living very close up with death.
From the audience, more? Over there and over there.
Would the moderator please use a microphone?
Sorry, what?
Would the moderator please use a microphone?
There is a lav mic here.
It's not doing the job that the hand mics are doing. Thank you.
Hi, I don't have a question. I just have immense gratitude for all of you for being here, and to Leahy for putting this on, to Christina Stanley and her team for working with the ladies and putting this on. And I have an extra special thank you for Susan Block, because I read Being Immortal, and it allows me to be kinder to myself with my parents, who I'm lucky they're still living. They're 82 and 84. My mother is the most stubborn woman I think I've ever met in my life, and I'm sure many people in this room can say that, perhaps about their own mothers, but it now gives me the permission, your book gives me the permission to just step back and know she's making the decisions for how she's living her life, and that makes me happy. So thank you so much.
Hi. I've had a difficult a month or two. My husband's father passed away about a month ago. He was older, and he was okay with it, and my husband was okay with it. And then maybe a week and a half later, my husband's mother's sister died, and we think she stayed alive just long enough to spite her brother-in-law, who she didn't like very much. But meanwhile, the person who's left is my husband's mother, who is 90, going to be 92. She lives in assisted living. Her sister lived right near her. She and her sister and ex-husband were all Holocaust survivors. But my mother-in-law can barely see. She can't hear very well, and she seems to have just lost any interest in anything, especially now that her sister, who she had this really intense love-hate relationship with, she doesn't have anyone to fight with anymore. And she just, we can't have a conversation with her. She just seems not interested in anything, and I don't know what to do about it. Do you have any suggestions?
So, grief portrays itself in many different flavors. But normal grief can be up to 18 months. And I think that making sure, at least in my world, what I tell families is, especially when it comes to spouses, because we know that when, especially during long-term marriages, when a spouse dies, on average 1 to 2 years for another spouse, just from the sense of loss. So there's no easy answer, but the idea of maintaining purpose and contact and communication and understanding and perseverance for the loved ones around this person, I think are key. I wish there was something magical. I tell families, I do have a wand, a magical wand. It's in the garage. When I find it, I will cure all these problems. And everybody is so different and is so troubled at times. So the fact that you're asking the question means that you are there and you are ready to provide support and do what needs to be done in order to make this person feel valued and not alone.
Well, she's going to the next question. I have a question for the panel. I asked a lot of questions in the film, and I'm just curious about this. We quoted at the beginning of the movie Ernest Becker, who was a philosopher that wrote a book called The Denial of Death, I believe. And I think he won a Pulitzer Prize after he died and became famous after he died. But from my understanding of his book, one of his main points was that if you deny your immortality and you kind of walk around with that weight, that it will have adverse effects on your life. And I'm curious if any of the doctors would like to comment on that.
Well, I would say it goes back to that same sense of we as doctors don't like bringing it up. We don't like to make people sad. It's something that we know nobody seems to want to talk about, so we avoid it as much as you do. But talking about it doesn't make it happen. And actually talking about it is really, it's not about dying. As Cindy said, it's about how do you want to live until you die. And we're all going to die, and we don't know how, we don't know when. But even when we're 21 or we're 51 or we're 71 or at where we are at every point in our lives, we have values and we have things that mean something to us. And I think it's important to acknowledge what gives us meaning at each of those times. The same way as Susan was saying, asking her father what really meant joy to him, having chocolate ice cream and watching sports. That's one of the things I think most of us palliative care doctors learn the most is what is important to you. And just knowing that little piece makes it very easy then to help a family figure out what would be an acceptable quality of life from someone. But I think it's still something that we just have to make more normal. We ask everybody, are you safe at home? I remember when we first had to do that in primary care. We thought, my God, people are, what are they thinking? But you get asked that every single time. I think it's important to be able to say what's important to you and what are your wishes and goals in the future.
I just want to ask a question, too, before we go back out here. Doctor friend I was playing golf with the other day, we were talking about me hosting this thing, and this came up, which I didn't know about, and I'm sure you guys all do, the Massical Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment form, or MOLST. Can somebody tell who knows about this what this is all about and whether this is something people should be doing, filling in?
So it is a medical order for your choices about life-sustaining treatment. And just so you know, in Massachusetts and in most other states, if you haven't made a decision about limiting any aggressive life-saving interventions, the automatic for any EMT is going to be to intervene and do CPR, which means everything and anything that could possibly revive you. Sometimes we talk about what parts of CPR you would tolerate, but the reality is, I always say it means basically if you were to die, do you want us to do everything we have medically available to try to revive you? And if not, then that would mean making a decision about not wanting CPR. And not wanting CPR does not mean not living and not treating. It just means if somebody is at a point where the end of life has come, and many times if we're very ill or very old, we don't want to have those things done. And so it's important, if that's how you feel, that you make sure your doctor works on this order with you, because it's the only thing then that will protect you from having something done that you would not want. And until you feel strongly about not wanting that done, don't ever feel pressured to think that you have to make that sort of decision. Instead, it's more important to make sure who your voice is going to be, if you were really ill, would know what the limits would be, as Dr. Block said her father would say. So if my father can eat chocolate ice cream and watch sports, okay, then we'll go ahead and try to be as aggressive as possible. But it is important if you have a strong feeling that you don't want something done. And if you're not sure, that's what your whole healthcare team is here to help keep talking to you about it and help walking with you so you make those decisions.
Can I add something there? I think what everybody needs is a healthcare proxy or a durable power of attorney for healthcare. How many of you have one? Okay. So everybody should have one as a way of protecting yourselves. And the most important thing you should do once you sign one is to talk to that person so they know what you want and what you don't want. Okay? And without talking to them, they're just guessing. Okay? So that's something that is really critical for everybody to have. And the reason that's so important is you can't anticipate what's going to happen to you. And you need somebody you really trust, who really knows what's in your head about this stuff, who can help step in and, make a determination in the moment about something unusual, that you may not have expressed directly. You need someone who knows you well and who you've talked to as much as you can. And I think it's a really critical element for everybody. The MOLST form, Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, is really designed for people who are old, quite ill, and who have very, very strong preferences. The problem with MOLST is that you can't anticipate everything that would happen, and the paradigmatic problem with something like MOLST is I'm not a big fan of CPR for myself. I don't think I would want it under a lot of circumstances. But if tomorrow I'm eating lunch and I choke on a chicken bone, from which somebody could revive me, I definitely want someone to give me the Heimlich maneuver and give me oxygen and do those things. And the problem with the MOLST, if you do it too early, is people might not do it. And so the issues, this is really for people who are pretty clear who are very clear about what they want, as Beth was saying, very sick, and kind of have some ability to project what might happen and what they might die of. If you have cancer, if you have heart disease, if you have bad COPD, those are people who need that. Or if you're very old and you're very kind of clear, again, that you don't want to continue living with certain circumstances. So I just think people are, one of the challenges in Massachusetts is that this is being promulgated for people for whom it is, I think, dangerous. And to fill one of these things out too soon is a dangerous thing. But it's critical, as Beth was saying, that in the situations where you know what you want, you're sick, or you're quite advanced in age.
Do you think a living will is a good idea? Anybody?
Personally?
Yeah, sure.
Is a living will.
Living will?
Yeah.
Is that a good idea, do you think, for most people to have?
So I think it comes down to communication, period. Doctors we learn in medical school that the essence of patient care is communication. But when it comes to this stuff, we aren't good communicators. So I can tell you, if I could just segue on here and maybe answer your question, but I'm not sure. I want to segue off of what Dr. Block and Beth Collins were saying, is that a couple of things are happening, very positive things in Massachusetts. We have 4 medical schools in Massachusetts. Ariadne Labs is championing the inclusion of serious illness conversation training with medical students. I was not taught how to talk seriously about significant illness with patients. It wasn't until much later in my fellowship and training that I learned how to do it. And for some of us, it's natural, but for some of us, it's not. That's one. Number two, so curricula in medical schools are going to change. That's awesome. Number two, Leahy has partnered with an organization that Beth can maybe talk more about, Honoring Choices, in which we learn that individuals should have discussions about healthcare proxies and their wishes. And what's the third thing? And the third thing is I'm a geriatrician and I'm already experiencing memory loss. But I remember what the third thing is. The third thing is that once again, as Dr. Grant had mentioned at the beginning, Ariadne Laboratories is working with Leahy, and we will be training Leahy providers to have these serious illness conversations as well. So it's all about communication. The MOLST form is no good without communication. It's all about communication. So we're investing in it. It's being invested in throughout Massachusetts, but that's the key. So living will doesn't matter. Having the conversation and documenting the conversation is what matters in helping everyone to have the quality of life and end of life that they should.
Good afternoon. My name is Liz Sacco, and I'm the co-chair of the Education Committee. And I would like to express my gratitude to our esteemed panelists for providing us with such an informative presentation, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. We'd like to share with you a token of our appreciation, which I will present to you in just a moment. But we'd also like to thank our sponsors, Wingate Healthcare, Northbridge Insurance Agency, and the Northbridge Companies, Bayberry, and Stonebridge. I hope that you've all enjoyed the presentation and that you will join us on March 21st for our third lecture of the season. The topic will be Your Weight at Any Age, What It Means to Be Healthy, and How to Do It Safely. We look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, we would welcome your support and partnership in our fundraising efforts. If you'd like to learn more about the Women's Leadership Council or join our mailing list, please feel free to talk with any of the members of the Women's Leadership Council who are wearing name tags, or Paul Higgins, who is in the philanthropy department. In addition, we would love to hear your feedback about this event and learn about topics that are important to you or your family for a possible presentation in the future. Thank you again for coming, and thank you again to our panel, and we hope to see you next time.